When poverty-stricken rancher Thomas Whitmore sheltered a mysterious girl from a raging storm, he thought he was simply showing kindness to a desperate stranger. But as armed men surrounded his failing ranch demanding her return, Thomas discovered his unexpected guest was Sarah Calloway, daughter of the ruthless railroad baron who planned to destroy everything Thomas had left. Would protecting one lost girl cost him his land, his life, and everything he held dear? The gunshot that split the morning air wasn't meant for Thomas Whitmore, but it might as well have been. He dropped his water bucket and ran toward the sound, boots pounding across the dry earth of his ranch. Behind his barn, he found his last milk cow lying still, blood pooling beneath her neck. Thomas fell to his knees beside the animal. Someone had shot Bessie during the night. Now he had no milk to sell, no cheese to make, and no hope of paying what he owed the bank. His hands shook as he touched the cow's cold fur. "Why?" he whispered to the empty sky. The November wind gave him no answer. It only pushed tumbleweeds across his land like nature was already cleaning up after his failure. Thomas stood slowly, his back aching from too many years of hard work and not enough food. At 43, he felt like an old man. His small wooden house sat in the distance, looking lonely against the big Wyoming sky. The paint had peeled off the walls months ago. The roof leaked when it rained. The windows needed glass, but glass cost money he didn't have. Everything had gone wrong since Martha died. Thomas picked up his water bucket and walked back toward the house. Each step reminded him of the boots he needed to buy, the clothes he needed to mend, the bills he needed to pay. The bucket felt heavier than it should. Even carrying water was getting hard for him. Inside his kitchen, Thomas made coffee from chicory root. Real coffee was too expensive now. He sat at the table where he and Martha used to eat breakfast together. Her empty chair stared at him like an old friend who had stopped talking. The silence in the house was the worst part. No more of Martha's singing while she cooked. No more of her stories about the day ahead. No more of her gentle voice saying his name when she needed help reaching something high. Just silence that grew bigger every day. Thomas opened the letter from the bank for the third time. The words hadn't changed. He had until Christmas to pay what he owed or they would take his ranch. 6 weeks to find money he didn't have. 6 weeks to save everything he and Martha had built together. He folded the letter and put it back in the drawer with all the other bills. Maybe if he ignored them long enough, they would disappear. But Thomas knew better. Problems never solved themselves. Outside, his horse whinnied from the corral. At least Duke was still alive. Thomas had been afraid someone might steal him too. These days, desperate people did desperate things. Thomas understood that feeling. He walked to his bedroom and looked at Martha's clothes still hanging in the closet. Her blue dress, her Sunday hat, her warm winter coat. Thomas couldn't bring himself to pack them away. Sometimes he would touch the fabric and remember how she felt when he hugged her. Martha had believed in him when nobody else did. She had followed him to Wyoming when it was still wild and dangerous. She had worked beside him to build their ranch from nothing. She had made him feel like he was worth something. Now Thomas felt worth nothing at all. He returned to the kitchen and stared out the window at his land. Brown grass stretched to the horizon. No cattle grazed there anymore. He had sold them one by one to pay for Martha's medicine. The medicine that hadn't saved her anyway. The barn needed new boards. The fence needed fixing. The well needed cleaning. Every part of his ranch was breaking down, just like Thomas himself. Some days he wondered why he kept trying. But then he would remember Martha's last words to him. "Promise me you won't give up," she had whispered. "Promise me you'll keep fighting." Thomas had promised. Now he was starting to think he had lied. A hawk circled overhead looking for something to hunt. Thomas envied the bird. Hawks didn't worry about money or banks or dead cows. They just flew and hunted and lived. The sun was getting higher, which meant the day was getting hotter. Thomas needed to drag Bessie's body away from the barn before it started to smell. He needed to figure out who had shot her and why. He needed to find a way to make money without a cow to milk. He needed a miracle. Thomas finished his chicory coffee and put on his worn hat. The day wasn't going to get any easier, but sitting inside feeling sorry for himself wouldn't help anything. Martha had taught him that much. As he walked toward the barn, Thomas noticed something strange. Fresh horse tracks led up to where Bessie had been shot, then continued toward the main road. The tracks were deep, which meant the horse was carrying a heavy rider. Someone with good boots had stepped down and walked around the cow. This wasn't random. Someone had come to his ranch on purpose to kill his cow. But who would do such a thing? And why? Thomas knelt down to study the tracks more carefully. The horse had good shoes, the kind that cost money. The rider's boots left clear prints in the mud near the water trough. Whoever this was, they weren't poor like Thomas. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the wind. Someone was trying to hurt him on purpose. Someone wanted to make sure he couldn't pay the bank. Someone wanted him to fail. But who knew enough about his troubles to know that killing his cow would finish him? The storm hit like a wild animal attacking the land. Thomas had seen the dark clouds building all afternoon, but nothing had prepared him for the fury that now shook his house. Rain hammered against his windows so hard he thought the glass might break. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, turning night into day for quick, bright moments. Thunder crashed overhead like giant boulders falling from heaven. The wind howled around his house like wolves hunting for a way inside. Thomas sat by his fireplace trying to read one of Martha's old books. But the storm was too loud and too violent for him to think about anything else. Every flash of lightning made shadows dance on his walls like ghosts. Then he saw something impossible. Through the rain and darkness, a small figure was stumbling toward his house. Thomas jumped up and pressed his face against the window. Lightning flashed again, and he could see clearly now. A young girl was walking through his front gate, her dress soaked and torn. She fell down in his yard, tried to get up, then fell again. Thomas grabbed his coat and ran outside into the storm. The rain hit him like cold bullets, and the wind tried to knock him over. He could barely see the girl through the sheets of water falling from the sky. "Hey!" he shouted, but the thunder swallowed his voice. The girl looked up when he reached her. She was maybe 16 years old, with long brown hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her dress had once been fine and pretty, but now it was muddy and ripped. Her face was pale and frightened. "Please," she gasped, reaching out to him. "Help me." Thomas didn't ask questions. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her toward his house. She was lighter than a sack of grain, and she was shivering so hard her whole body shook. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Inside his house, Thomas set her down gently by the fire. He grabbed Martha's warmest blanket and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. She hugged the blanket tight and moved closer to the flames. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas looked at her more carefully now. Even soaked and muddy, he could tell her dress was made from expensive fabric. Her hands were soft, not rough like the hands of ranch women. Her speech was careful and educated, like she had been taught by fancy teachers. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. The girl hesitated, her dark eyes darting toward the window as lightning flashed again. "Sarah," she said finally. "My name is Sarah." "Well, Sarah, what are you doing out in a storm like this? Where did you come from?" Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I was traveling. My horse got scared by the thunder and ran away. I've been walking for hours." Thomas frowned. The nearest town was 20 miles away. No 16-year-old girl could walk that far in a storm like this. And where were the people she had been traveling with? Nobody traveled alone in this territory, especially not young women. "Are you hurt?" he asked instead of pressing for more answers. Sarah shook her head, but Thomas could see blood on her feet from walking barefoot on rocks and thorns. He brought warm water and clean rags to clean her cuts. She winced when he touched her feet, but she didn't complain. "These need proper bandaging," Thomas said. "And you need dry clothes." He brought some of Martha's old dresses from the bedroom. They would be too big for Sarah, but they were clean and warm. While she changed behind a sheet hung across the corner, Thomas made hot soup from the last of his vegetables. When Sarah came out wearing Martha's blue dress, Thomas felt his heart squeeze tight. For just a moment, he could almost pretend Martha was there again. But Sarah was much younger than Martha had been, and much more mysterious. "The soup smells wonderful," Sarah said, sitting at the table. Thomas served her a bowl and watched her eat. She held her spoon properly and chewed with her mouth closed, like she had been taught good manners. But she ate quickly, like someone who hadn't had food in a long time. "How long since you last ate?" Thomas asked. 2 days, Sarah admitted. That explained why she was so thin and pale. Thomas gave her another bowl of soup and some bread. She ate everything he put in front of her. "Where are your family?" Thomas asked carefully. Sarah's face changed, becoming hard and sad at the same time. "Gone," she said simply. Thomas understood that feeling. He didn't ask any more questions about her family. Outside, the storm was getting worse instead of better. The wind was now strong enough to shake the whole house. Rain was coming down like the world was flooding. No person could travel in weather like this. "You'll stay here tonight," Thomas said. "The storm should pass by morning." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous." Thomas almost smiled. This skinny girl who weighed less than a lamb was worried about being dangerous to him. "I don't think you're dangerous," he said. "Just lost." Sarah stared into the fire, her face thoughtful. "My father always said never trust strangers. He said people only help others when they want something in return." "What do I want from you?" Thomas asked. Sarah looked around his small, poor house, at his patched clothes and his simple furniture, at the empty spaces where expensive things should be. "I don't know," she said quietly. "That's what worries me." But Thomas could see something else in her eyes. Relief. Like she had been running from something terrible and his house was the first safe place she had found. Thunder crashed overhead again and Sarah jumped. Thomas noticed she kept looking toward the windows like she was afraid someone might be out there watching. "Nobody can travel in this storm," Thomas said gently. "Whatever you're running from, it can't follow you tonight." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "How did you know I was running?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone's scared," Thomas said. "And I know what it feels like to be alone." The fire crackled between them, warm and bright against the storm outside. Sarah pulled Martha's blanket around her shoulders like armor. "What if they don't stop looking for me?" she whispered. Sarah woke up screaming. Thomas dropped his coffee cup and rushed to the small bedroom where the girl thrashed against invisible enemies. Her arms swung wildly as if fighting off attackers that only she could see. "Hey, now you're safe," Thomas whispered, keeping his distance. He had learned long ago that touching someone caught in a nightmare could make things worse. "Sarah, wake up. You're in my cabin." Her eyes snapped open, wild and frightened. For a moment, she didn't seem to know where she was. Then her breathing slowed and she looked around the simple room with its wooden walls and single window. "I'm sorry," she said, pulling Martha's old quilt tight around her shoulders. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Happens to the best of us," Thomas replied, though he wondered what kind of dreams could make a young girl fight so hard in her sleep. "Sun's been up for an hour anyway. You hungry?" Sarah nodded, then surprised him by standing up without help. Yesterday she could barely walk to the kitchen. Today she moved like someone trying to prove she wasn't weak. Over breakfast of cornmeal mush and the last of his preserved peaches, Thomas watched Sarah eat. She took small bites and chewed slowly like someone who had learned not to waste food. But her manners were too perfect for a girl who had been wandering alone. She held her spoon the way rich folks did in town, not like the frontier children Thomas knew. "Where did you say you came from?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Sarah's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. "I didn't say." "Well, your family must be worried sick." "No," Sarah said quickly. "They're not." The way she said it made Thomas's chest tighten. He had heard that same empty tone from Martha near the end when she stopped believing anyone could help her. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on helping with chores. Thomas tried to give her easy work, but she followed him to the chicken coop and began collecting eggs without being asked. Her movements were careful and practiced, as if she had done this before. "You know your way around a farm," Thomas observed, watching her gentle touch with the nervous hens. "My grandmother had chickens," Sarah said. Then she stopped talking as if she had said too much. As the morning wore on, Thomas noticed other strange things about his guest. Sarah could read the weather better than most ranchers, pointing out clouds that meant rain when the sky still looked clear. She knew which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick. But her hands were too soft for outdoor work and she flinched every time a horse neighed in the distance. The biggest surprise came when they reached the broken fence that separated his property from the main road. Thomas had been putting off the repair because he couldn't afford new wire. But Sarah studied the damage with the focused attention of someone solving a puzzle. "If you angled this post differently," she said, pointing to the crooked wooden beam, "the fence will be stronger. And you can use these old pieces to patch the holes instead of buying new wire." Thomas stared at her. The girl was right. He had been looking at the problem wrong, thinking he needed to replace everything when he could repair it with what he already had. "How did you figure that out?" he asked. Sarah's cheeks turned pink. I like fixing things." They worked together in comfortable silence, Sarah holding posts while Thomas hammered. The physical work seemed to calm her, and Thomas found himself relaxing too. It had been months since anyone had helped him with ranch chores. The shared effort reminded him of better times when Martha would work beside him and their small spread felt like a real home. As they finished the fence repair, a rider appeared on the horizon. Thomas felt Sarah tense beside him, her whole body going rigid with fear. "Get behind the barn," he told her quietly. "Don't come out until I say it's safe." Sarah didn't argue. She slipped away like a shadow, leaving Thomas to face the approaching stranger alone. The writer turned out to be Deputy Marshal Peters from town, a decent man who had always treated Thomas fairly. But today his face was grim. "Morning, Tom," Peters said, tipping his hat. "Got any visitors lately?" Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Why do you ask?" "There's been reports of a missing girl. Young, about 15, dark hair. Last seen heading this direction after she ran away from some fancy school in Denver." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Thomas said, which was technically true. Sarah looked younger than 15 to him. Peters studied Thomas's face for a long moment. "Well, if you do see anything strange, you let me know. There's people looking for this girl and they're offering a mighty big reward." After the deputy rode away, Thomas found Sarah crouched behind the barn, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. "Who's looking for you?" he asked gently. "People who want to hurt me," Sarah whispered. "People who think they own me." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. He had seen enough of the world to know that money could make some folks think they could buy anything, including other people's lives. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah did something that surprised Thomas again. She picked up one of Martha's old books and began to read aloud. Her voice was smooth and educated, pronouncing big words that most frontier children had never heard. The book was about far-off places with names like Paris and London, but Sarah made them sound real and exciting. Thomas found himself imagining cobblestone streets and grand buildings, worlds beyond the endless grass and sky of Wyoming territory. When Sarah finished reading, she looked up at Thomas with serious eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For not asking questions I can't answer. For letting me help instead of treating me like I'm made of glass. For making me feel like a person instead of a problem." Thomas felt something warm settle in his chest. He had thought he was just being neighborly, but maybe kindness meant more than he realized. As Sarah prepared for bed, Thomas noticed her examining the window latches and testing the door locks. Whatever had put the fear in her eyes was still out there, and she knew it. But for tonight, she was safe. And sometimes Thomas thought that was enough. The morning started wrong when Thomas couldn't find his best work shirt. He had torn it on the fence wire yesterday, and now it was missing from the hook where he always hung his clothes. Thomas scratched his head, wondering if his grief had finally made him lose his mind along with everything else. Then he heard humming from the kitchen. Sarah sat at Martha's old sewing table, her fingers moving quickly across fabric with a needle and thread. Thomas's shirt lay spread before her, and she was mending the tear with tiny, perfect stitches that would make it stronger than new. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" Thomas asked, amazed by the neat repair work. Sarah's hands stilled. My mother taught me." The way she said it made Thomas think her mother was gone, like his Martha. But the sewing was too fancy for any frontier woman he knew. The stitches were small and even, the kind of work that took years of practice and good light. "She must have been quite a seamstress," Thomas said carefully. "She was quite a lot of things," Sarah replied, her voice sad and proud at the same time. After breakfast, Thomas decided to hang Sarah's dress outside to air out. The storm had left it muddy and wrinkled, and the poor girl had been wearing his old clothes for 3 days. But when he lifted the dress from the chair where it had been drying, something crinkled inside the fabric. The dress was heavier than it should be. Thomas ran his fingers along the seams and felt something hard sewn into the lining near the waist. His curiosity got the better of him, and he examined the stitching more closely. One seam had started to come loose, probably from Sarah's rough journey through the storm. Through the small opening, Thomas could see the corner of what looked like papers. He should have stopped there. Should have respected Sarah's privacy and asked her about it directly. But something about the way she had been watching the horizon, the fear in her eyes when the deputy came by, made him worry that she might be in more danger than she was telling him. Gently, Thomas worked the opening wider until he could see what was hidden inside. Letters. Several of them, folded small and sewn into the dress lining like a secret pocket. The first letter made his blood run cold. It was addressed to Miss Sarah Calloway in elegant handwriting. The return address read J. Calloway, Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. Thomas had heard that name before. Every rancher in Wyoming territory knew about J. Calloway and his railroad empire. The man who bought failing farms for pennies and drove small ranchers off their land. The same company that wanted to run tracks right through Thomas's property. With shaking hands, Thomas pulled out more letters. They were all addressed to Sarah Calloway. Some came from the railroad office. Others came from something called Miss Henderson's Academy for Young Ladies in Denver. Sarah wasn't just any runaway girl. She was the daughter of the man who was slowly destroying everything Thomas had left. Thomas sank onto his bed, the letters scattered around him like autumn leaves. His mind raced as pieces of a puzzle fell into place. Sarah's perfect manners. Her educated way of speaking. Her knowledge about fixing things and reading weather. She had been raised with money and teachers, not on a struggling ranch. But if she was Calloway's daughter, why was she running? Why was she so frightened of the people looking for her? Thomas picked up one of the academy letters and read it more carefully. It talked about Sarah's continued difficulties with authority and her tendency to question inappropriate subjects. Another letter mentioned that Sarah had been expressing radical ideas about her father's business practices. The last letter was different. It was newer, written in Sarah's own handwriting but never sent. Thomas almost didn't read it, but the first line caught his attention. "Dear Papa, I cannot stay silent any longer about what you're doing to innocent families." The letter went on to describe things that made Thomas's stomach turn. Families driven from their homes in winter. Wells poisoned to force farmers to sell. Men who asked too many questions disappearing in the night. Sarah knew what her father was. More than that, she was trying to fight against it. Thomas heard footsteps outside and quickly shoved the letters back into the dress lining. But his hands were shaking and he couldn't get the seam to lie flat. When Sarah walked into the cabin, she took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You found them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, unable to find words. Sarah sat down across from him, her young face suddenly looking much older. "How much did you read?" "Enough," Thomas said. "Enough to know who your father is. And enough to know why you're running." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and Thomas could hear his few remaining cattle moving restlessly in the pasture. "Are you going to turn me in?" Sarah asked. "There's probably a reward." The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Is that what you think of me?" "I think you're a good man who's lost everything," Sarah said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I think you're about to lose your ranch to the bank and my father probably has enough money to solve all your problems. I think any reasonable person would take that deal." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his struggling land. Sarah was right about the bank. Right about his problems. Right about her father's money. But she was wrong about one thing. "I may not have much left," Thomas said, turning back to face her. "But I've got my word. And I gave you my word that you were safe here." Sarah looked up at him with something like wonder. "Even knowing who I am? Even knowing what my father will do to you when he finds out you helped me?" Thomas thought about everything he had lost. His wife. His cattle. His dreams of building something lasting on this hard land. Then he thought about Sarah reading to him by the firelight, working beside him to fix the fence, making his empty house feel like a home again. "Especially knowing who you are," Thomas said. "Takes courage to stand up to family. Takes even more courage to try to make things right." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He'll destroy you. That's what he does to people who get in his way." Maybe, Thomas agreed. But a man's got to decide what he's willing to fight for. And I reckon a girl brave enough to steal her father's secrets and risk everything to help strangers is worth fighting for. As the sun set through the cabin windows, Thomas and Sarah sat together planning what to do next. They both knew that Calloway's men would come eventually. The deputy's visit had been just the beginning. But for the first time since Martha died, Thomas felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. He had someone to protect, someone who needed him to be better than his circumstances. And sometimes Thomas thought that was enough to make a man feel rich. A gunshot split the morning air like thunder, making Thomas drop his coffee cup. The tin clattered against the porch steps as he spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. 6 riders crested the hill behind his barn, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that looked like smoke signals warning of trouble. "Sarah," Thomas called toward the cabin, his voice sharp with worry. "Get inside. Now." The girl appeared in the doorway, her face pale as winter snow. She took one look at the approaching men and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. "They found me," she whispered, her words barely louder than the wind. Thomas grabbed his rifle from beside the door, checking the bullets with practiced hands. His fingers moved steady despite the fear crawling up his spine like a cold snake. These weren't local boys looking for work or neighbors needing help. These men rode like they owned the world and everything in it. The leader sat tall in his saddle, wearing a black coat that probably cost more than Thomas made in a year. His hat was tilted just right, and his smile was the kind that made honest folks want to check their wallets. Behind him, 5 other men spread out like wolves surrounding a rabbit hole. Mr. Whitmore, the leader called out, his voice smooth as honey poured over broken glass. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect day for solving problems. Thomas stepped forward, keeping his rifle pointed down but ready. His boots made soft sounds on the dry dirt as he walked toward the gate. Don't recall having any problems that need solving, mister. The man in black laughed, a sound that made Thomas's skin crawl. Oh, but you do. You have something that belongs to someone very important. Someone who wants it back. I don't take things that aren't mine, Thomas said, stopping about 10 feet from the fence. Close enough to talk, far enough to move if trouble started. Never have, never will. Of course not, the man said, swinging down from his horse with the grace of someone who'd never done real work. Let me introduce myself. Name's Morrison. I work for people who solve problems for other people. Rich people. Powerful people. Morrison walked closer, his expensive boots crunching on the gravel. His eyes were the color of dirty water and they seemed to look right through Thomas like he was made of glass. The problem we're here to solve involves a young lady. About 16 years old. Pretty little thing with brown hair and green eyes. Thomas felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face calm. Years of playing poker in town had taught him not to show his cards too early. Lots of young ladies in the world, Mr. Morrison. You'll have to be more specific. Oh, I think you know exactly who I mean, Morrison said, his smile getting wider and nastier. See, this particular young lady ran away from a very expensive school in Denver. Her father is beside himself with worry. Can't eat, can't sleep, can't think about anything but getting his precious daughter back safe and sound. One of Morrison's men spat tobacco juice into the dirt and spoke up. We tracked her here, old man. No, she's hiding in that shack of yours. Thomas turned his attention to the speaker, a thick-built man with scars on his hands and meanness in his eyes. That so? And what makes you think that? Saw her through the window yesterday, Scarred Hands said. Pretty little dove in a blue dress. Don't try to tell us different. The morning sun was getting hotter and sweat started to trickle down Thomas's back. Not from the heat, but from the knowledge that these men weren't going to leave empty-handed. They'd come here with a job to do and they looked like the type who always finished their jobs. Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. Her father is prepared to be very generous to the man who helps bring her home. More money than a dirt farmer like you could make in 10 years. Thomas looked at the pouch, then back at Morrison's face. And if I don't have this girl you're looking for? Oh, but you do, Morrison said, his voice turning cold as a snake's belly. And we're not leaving without her. See, her father doesn't like to be disappointed. When he's disappointed, bad things happen to the people who disappoint him. Behind Thomas, the cabin door creaked open. He didn't turn around, but he could feel Sarah watching from the shadows. Her fear seemed to reach across the yard like invisible fingers, touching his heart and making him angry. Let me ask you something, Mr. Morrison, Thomas said, shifting his rifle slightly. What kind of father sends men with guns to drag his daughter home? What kind of love needs threats and violence to make it work? Morrison's smile disappeared like sun behind storm clouds. The kind that owns half this territory and could buy the other half before lunch. The kind that builds railroads and destroys anyone who gets in the way. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Railroad money. Railroad power. The same force that was already squeezing his ranch dry, calling in his debts, and planning to take his land. Now it had followed him home, wearing Morrison's face and demanding the one good thing that had happened to him since Martha died. Her name is Sarah Calloway, Morrison continued, watching Thomas's face carefully. Her father is William Calloway. Maybe you've heard of him. Thomas had heard of him, all right. Everyone in the territory had heard of William Calloway, the man who turned mountains into money and small towns into ghost towns. The man whose railroad companies bought judges and senators like other folks bought groceries. So what's it going to be, farmer? Morrison asked, pulling his coat back to show the gun on his hip. Easy way or hard way? Either works for us, but I'd recommend easy. Much less cleanup afterward. Thomas looked at each of the 6 men, memorizing their faces and the way they held their weapons. 5 of them looked like hired killers, but Morrison was different. He was smart, dangerous in a different way. The kind of man who could smile while he destroyed your life. I'll need some time to think about it, Thomas said finally. Morrison pulled out a gold pocket watch and checked the time. You've got until noon. That gives you about 2 hours to make the right decision. After that, we stop asking nicely. The men climbed back on their horses, but they didn't ride away. Instead, they spread out around the property, settling into positions where they could watch every door and window. Thomas realized with growing dread that they were setting up a siege. As Morrison mounted his horse, he called out one last warning. "Oh, and Mr. Whitmore? Don't even think about running. We've got men watching every road between here and town. The girl belongs to her father, and she's going home today whether she wants to or not." Thomas watched them position themselves like pieces on a chessboard, and he knew the game had already begun. The question was whether he was smart enough, brave enough, or desperate enough to find a way to win it. Sarah's hands shook as she poured water into the wash basin, each drop hitting the metal like tiny hammer blows. Through the window, she could see Morrison's men settling in for a long wait, their rifles glinting in the sunlight like hungry eyes. "They won't give up," she said without turning around. "Papa doesn't accept defeat. Ever." Thomas closed the door and set his rifle against the wall. His mind was spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud, trying to find some way out of this mess that didn't end with blood on his land. "Tell me about your father, Sarah. Help me understand what we're dealing with." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound that made Thomas's heart ache. "What do you want to know? That he owns 17 railroad companies? That he has 3 governors in his pocket? That he once burned down an entire town because they wouldn't sell him the right of way he wanted?" Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Outside, he could hear Morrison's men talking and laughing like they were at a church picnic instead of surrounding an innocent man's home. "Start at the beginning. How did you end up running from your own father?" Sarah finally turned around and Thomas saw tears streaming down her cheeks. But her voice stayed strong, like steel wrapped in silk. "It started when I found out what really happened to Mama." She sat across from him at the small wooden table, her fingers tracing patterns in the worn wood. "Papa always told me she died in a carriage accident when I was little. Said it was quick and painless, that she didn't suffer. But that wasn't true?" "No." Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I found her real death certificate in Papa's office last month. She died in a hospital in Chicago. Alone. Papa had her put away because she was asking too many questions about his business deals." Thomas felt anger building in his chest like steam in a kettle. Put away. In an asylum. For speaking out against him. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She tried to stop him from destroying a farming community in Kansas. When she wouldn't be quiet about it, he had doctors declare her insane. She died there 3 years later, still trying to get people to listen to her. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. Thomas had seen plenty of evil in his 43 years, but this was different. This was the kind of cold, calculated cruelty that turned his stomach. "That's why you ran away?" Sarah nodded, then shook her head. "That was part of it. But the real reason was what I learned about you." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. "About me? Papa's been planning to take your land for months. The railroad wants to run a line right through your property, and you're the only holdout in the valley. Everyone else has already sold or been forced out." She reached across the table and took his rough hands in her small ones. "The bank didn't call in your debt by accident, Thomas. Papa bought your mortgage last spring. He's been squeezing you slowly, waiting for you to break." The room seemed to spin around Thomas as the pieces fell into place. His loan being called early. The sudden increase in his supply costs. The way other ranchers had started avoiding him in town. It hadn't been bad luck at all. It had been William Calloway playing with his life like a cat with a mouse. "But why run to me?" Thomas asked. "If you knew what your father was planning, why come here?" Sarah's grip on his hands tightened. "Because I wanted to see what kind of man he was destroying. I wanted to look in your eyes and see if you deserved what was happening to you." "And what did you see?" "I saw someone who took in a stranger without asking for anything in return. Someone who gave me your wife's quilt to keep warm. Someone who shared his food even though I could see you barely had enough for yourself." Her voice broke slightly. "I saw everything Papa taught me didn't exist anymore. Kindness. Honor. Goodness that doesn't ask for payment." Thomas pulled his hands free and stood up, walking to the window. Morrison was sitting on a rock, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. The casual way he did it made Thomas's skin crawl. "Your father will never stop coming for you," Thomas said quietly. "Men like that don't give up on what they think belongs to them." "I know." Sarah's voice was small but determined. "But I can't go back. If I do, I'll never be free again. He'll marry me off to some business partner who can help expand his empire. I'll end up like Mama, locked away the moment I try to speak up about the terrible things he does." Thomas turned back to face her. In the morning light, she looked younger than her 16 years, but there was something in her green eyes that reminded him of Martha. The same quiet strength that had helped his wife face down blizzards and broken bones and the 100 small disasters that came with frontier life. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her dress pocket. She pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "I took this from Papa's safe before I ran. It's Mama's diary from the last year of her life." She opened the journal and began to read in a voice that shook with emotion. "He came to see me today with 2 men in white coats. They said I was sick, that my mind was diseased because I couldn't understand how business works. But I'm not sick. I'm just trying to save people from what William is doing to them." Thomas listened as Sarah read more entries, each one painting a picture of a woman slowly losing hope as the walls closed in around her. A woman who had tried to use her position as Calloway's wife to help the people he was crushing, only to find herself crushed in return. "The last entry is different," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "She wrote it the night before she died." "What does it say?" Sarah's hands trembled as she found the page. "If anyone ever reads this, know that my husband William Calloway is not the man the newspapers say he is. He destroys communities for profit. He bribes officials to get what he wants. He silences anyone who speaks against him. I pray that someday someone will find the courage to stop him. Someone braver than I was." The journal snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. Outside, Thomas could hear Morrison calling to one of his men, asking about lunch. They were settling in for a siege, confident that time was on their side. "She was brave," Thomas said quietly. "It takes courage to stand up to power even when you know you can't win." Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of hope and fear. "Will you help me finish what she started? Will you help me find a way to stop him?" Thomas looked out the window again at Morrison's men, then back at the girl who had brought both danger and purpose to his failing ranch. He thought about Martha, who had always said that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they owned but by what they were willing to sacrifice for what was right. "Yes," he said simply. "But first, we need to survive the next few hours. Your father's men aren't going to wait much longer, and when they come, they'll come hard and fast." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, her small frame silhouetted against the glass. "Then we'd better be ready for them." The first gunshot shattered the kitchen window like thunder breaking heaven. Thomas dove sideways, pulling Sarah behind the heavy wooden table as glass showered down like deadly rain. Outside, horses stamped and men shouted orders that cut through the night air. 20 riders, maybe more," Thomas whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear boots crunching on gravel, moving closer to the cabin walls. These weren't the same men from this morning. These riders carried torches that painted dancing shadows across the walls. Sarah's fingers dug into his arm. "They found us." Another shot punched through the front door, splintering wood inches from where they crouched. Thomas grabbed his rifle from beside the fireplace, checking the bullets with hands that stayed steady despite everything falling apart around them. "Sarah," a voice boomed from outside. "Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt." Thomas recognized Morrison's voice, but there was something different now. Something meaner. The man sounded like he was done playing games. "We know you're in there, girl," Morrison continued. "Your daddy's getting real tired of waiting." Thomas felt Sarah stiffen beside him. Through the broken window, he could see torches moving in a wide circle around the cabin. These men weren't here to talk. They were here to take what they wanted, one way or another. "The back door," Thomas breathed into Sarah's ear. "We can make it to the barn." But Sarah shook her head hard. "They'll have men there too. Papa never leaves anything to chance." As if she'd called it into being, they heard voices from behind the cabin. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden porch Thomas had built with his own hands. The sound of his life being invaded made anger burn hot in his chest. "Whitmore." Morrison's voice carried a new edge. "You got 1 minute to send out the girl. After that, we start shooting everything that moves." Thomas closed his eyes for a heartbeat, thinking fast. The cabin had thick walls, but not thick enough to stop 20 rifles. The root cellar under the kitchen might work, but they'd have to cross open ground to reach it. "Can you shoot?" he asked Sarah quietly. Her eyes went wide. I never." "That's okay." Thomas handed her a smaller pistol from his belt. "Just point and pull if anyone gets close." The sound of breaking glass came from the back bedroom. They were coming in from all sides now, like wolves closing on wounded deer. Thomas could hear heavy breathing just outside the kitchen window. "Time's up, rancher," Morrison yelled. The front door exploded inward. Thomas fired twice into the doorway, sending the first man stumbling backward with a curse. But more shadows moved behind him, and the broken window suddenly filled with the barrel of a rifle. "Move!" Thomas grabbed Sarah's hand and rolled toward the kitchen, bullets chewing up the floorboards where they'd been hiding. They made it behind the iron stove just as 3 men rushed through the front door. Thomas fired again, and one man spun around with a shout. But his rifle clicked empty, and he had no time to reload. "Got you now?" One of the men raised his gun. But Sarah surprised everyone. She threw Martha's heavy iron pot straight at the man's head. It connected with a sound like a church bell, and he went down hard. "Nice throw," Thomas said, grabbing more bullets from his pocket. "Papa taught me to defend myself," Sarah said with a shaky smile. "Just not against his own men." More glass broke in the back room. They were coming from everywhere now, like water finding cracks in a dam. Thomas could hear them moving through his home, breaking things that could never be replaced. The cellar, he decided. It's our only chance. They crawled across the kitchen floor while bullets whistled overhead. The wooden trapdoor to the root cellar lay hidden under a small rug Martha had made years ago. Thomas pulled it open, revealing a dark hole that smelled of potatoes and earth. "Down," he whispered, helping Sarah into the darkness. She dropped into the small space below, and Thomas followed just as boots thundered across the kitchen floor above them. He pulled the trapdoor shut and prayed the rug would hide it well enough. In the tiny cellar, they could barely move. Sarah pressed against him in the darkness, both of them trying to breathe quietly while chaos raged overhead. They could hear men shouting to each other, searching every corner of the cabin. "Where are they?" Morrison's voice sounded angry now, frustrated. "Maybe they got out the back," another man suggested. "Check the barn. Check everywhere." Boots stomped directly over their heads. Sarah grabbed Thomas's hand so tight it hurt, but he didn't mind. In the darkness, he could feel her shaking like a scared rabbit. "It's okay," he breathed into her ear, so quiet the words barely made sound. "We're safe for now." But even as he said it, Thomas knew it wasn't really true. They were trapped like mice in a hole, and the cats were getting closer. Soon Morrison would think to check under floors and behind walls. Soon their hiding place would become their tomb. Above them, something heavy crashed to the floor. Probably his kitchen table, the one he'd made for Martha when they first got married. The sound of his life being destroyed piece by piece made Thomas's jaw clench tight. "Burn it," Morrison said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the floorboards. "If they won't come out, we'll smoke them out." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In the tiny cellar, the smell of smoke would mean death in minutes. There would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "Wait," another voice said. Thomas had never heard this one before, but it carried the kind of authority that made other men listen. "My employer wants them alive." Thomas felt his blood turn cold. The employer. Sarah's father had come himself. "Mr. Calloway?" Morrison sounded surprised. "I thought you were staying in town." "Plans changed," the new voice said smoothly. "I want to meet this rancher who thinks my daughter is worth dying for." In the darkness, Sarah made a small sound like a hurt animal. Thomas squeezed her hand tighter, wishing he could take away the pain in that sound. "Bring them out," Calloway ordered. "Search every board, every stone. They're here somewhere." The sound of systematic searching began overhead. These men knew their business now, working with the patience of professionals. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the rug wasn't quite straight, before curious hands pulled it aside. "Thomas," Sarah whispered so quiet he felt her breath more than heard her words. "I'm sorry. This is all my fault." He turned toward her in the darkness, wishing he could see her face. "None of this is your fault. You didn't choose your father. But I chose to stay here. I chose to put you in danger. And I chose to let you stay," Thomas whispered back. "Best choice I ever made." Outside their tiny hiding place, the world was burning down. But somehow, sitting in the dark with this brave girl beside him, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since Martha died. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The footsteps overhead grew closer, more focused. Soon, very soon, their hiding place would be discovered. And then Thomas would have to face the most powerful man in the territory with nothing but truth and stubbornness to protect them both. The trapdoor ripped open like the lid of a coffin, flooding their hiding place with lamplight that hurt their eyes. Thomas blinked up at the circle of faces staring down at them, rifles pointed like angry fingers at his heart. Well, Morrison sneered, reaching down to grab Sarah's arm. "Look what we found hiding like rats." Thomas knocked Morrison's hand away and climbed out first, keeping himself between Sarah and the guns. The kitchen looked like a tornado had torn through it. Broken dishes covered the floor, and his wife's rocking chair lay on its side with one arm snapped clean off. "Careful with them," a calm voice said from the doorway. Thomas looked up and saw the man who owned half the Western Territory. William Calloway stood in the ruins of Thomas's home like he owned that too, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Thomas made in 5 years. He was smaller than Thomas had expected, with pale eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Whitmore," Calloway said, like they were meeting at a church social. "I've heard interesting things about you." "Can't say the same," Thomas replied, helping Sarah to her feet. She stayed close behind him, her small hands gripping his shirt. Calloway smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. "You've caused me considerable trouble, rancher. Do you know what it costs to chase one runaway girl across 3 territories? Maybe you should ask yourself why she ran," Thomas said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's hand moved to his gun, but Calloway waved him off with the lazy gesture of a king dismissing a servant. "Sarah, dear," Calloway said, not taking his eyes off Thomas. "Come here." Sarah pressed closer to Thomas instead. "No, Papa." It was the first time Thomas had heard her use that word, and it sounded like poison in her mouth. Calloway's face didn't change, but something flickered behind his pale eyes. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, daughter. Mr. Morrison's men have been very patient, but their patience has limits." Thomas could feel the guns pointed at them like heat from a fire. One word from Calloway and it would all be over. But he'd rather die standing than live on his knees. "She's not going anywhere," Thomas said quietly. Calloway laughed, a sound like winter whined through dead trees. Bold words from a man who owns nothing but debt. "Tell me, rancher, what exactly do you think you can offer my daughter?" "Freedom," Thomas answered without hesitation. "Freedom?" Calloway repeated the word like it tasted bad. "Freedom to sleep in a falling-down cabin? Freedom to eat beans and hardtack? Freedom to watch you lose this pathetic ranch to the bank?" Thomas felt each word like a punch to the gut because they were all true. He was a poor man with empty pockets and a failing farm. What did he have to offer a girl who'd grown up with silk dresses and servants? "Papa, stop," Sarah said, stepping out from behind Thomas. "You don't understand anything." "I understand that you're 16 years old and think you know everything," Calloway replied coldly. "I understand that this man has filled your head with romantic nonsense about the noble poor." Sarah's face flushed red. "Thomas has never lied to me. Can you say the same?" The silence that followed felt dangerous. Morrison shifted nervously and the other men looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Nobody talked to William Calloway like that, not even his own daughter. "What lies?" Calloway asked, his voice deadly quiet. "About Mama," Sarah said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "About why she really died." Thomas saw Calloway's face go white as fresh snow. Whatever Sarah was talking about, it hit the railroad baron like a physical blow. "Sarah," Calloway warned, "you don't know what you're saying." "I know she didn't die of fever," Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger. "I know she died because she couldn't stand what you'd become. I know she took those pills on purpose." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Thomas felt his heart break for the pain in Sarah's voice, but he also saw something else. For the first time since entering the cabin, William Calloway looked like just a man instead of a force of nature. "That's enough," Calloway said, but his voice shook slightly. "Is it?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I have more. I know about the bribes in Colorado. I know about the families you destroyed in Kansas. I know why you really want me back." Morrison started to say something, but Calloway cut him off with a sharp gesture. The railroad baron studied his daughter like she was a business problem that needed solving. "You think you know so much," Calloway said finally. "But you're still just a child playing with adult secrets." "I'm not a child anymore," Sarah replied. "Thomas taught me that." Calloway's pale eyes fixed on Thomas like gun sights. "What exactly did you teach her, rancher?" Thomas met that stare without flinching. "That a person's worth isn't measured by how much money they have. That sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the profitable thing." "How noble," Calloway sneered. "And how foolish. Money is the only thing that matters in this world, Mr. Whitmore. Everything else is just pretty words." "If that's true," Thomas said, "then why are you so afraid of losing your daughter?" The question hit its target. Calloway's careful mask slipped for just a moment, and Thomas saw the scared father underneath the powerful businessman. "I'm not afraid of anything," Calloway said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Then prove it," Sarah said suddenly. "Let me choose." All eyes turned to her. She stood straighter now, looking more like her father than Thomas had ever noticed. She had the same stubborn jaw, the same fierce intelligence in her eyes. "What?" Calloway asked. "Let me choose where I want to live," Sarah repeated. "If money is all that matters, then by my choice. Offer Thomas enough money to make him send me away." Thomas started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. She was looking at her father with the calculating gaze of someone who understood exactly what game they were playing. Go ahead, Papa, Sarah continued. Make your offer. Show Thomas and everyone here that every man has his price. Calloway's eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride or might have been anger. Very well. Mr. Whitmore, I offer you $10,000 to send my daughter home with me tonight. The number hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. $10,000 would save his ranch, pay off all his debts, and leave him wealthy enough to start over anywhere he wanted. It was more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of ranching. But as he looked at Sarah's trusting face, Thomas realized something that surprised him. The money didn't matter. Nothing Calloway could offer would make him betray the girl who'd brought light back into his dark world. No, Thomas said simply. Calloway blinked like he'd been slapped. I'm sorry. I said no, Thomas repeated. She's not for sale. 20,000, Calloway said quickly. No. 50,000. Not if you offered me the whole territory, Thomas said. Some things can't be bought. For the first time in his life, William Calloway looked like a man who'd run out of options. He stared at Thomas with something that might have been respect or might have been hatred. You're a fool, rancher, Calloway said finally. Maybe, Thomas agreed. But I'm a fool who can sleep at night. In the silence that followed, everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken windows and reminding them all that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. The sound of 20 rifles clicking ready split the night air like breaking bones. Thomas felt his heart slam against his ribs as he stared into the cold eyes of the most powerful man in the Western Territories. Behind Calloway, shadows moved, more men than Thomas had ever seen in one place, all pointing death in his direction. Well, Calloway's voice cut through the darkness. Every man has his number, rancher. What's yours? Sarah's small hand found Thomas's arm, her fingers trembling like autumn leaves. The girl who had mended his shirts and shared his simple meals now stood between him and enough money to save 10 ranches. But something deep in Thomas's chest, something that had been sleeping since Martha died, suddenly roared to life. She ain't for sale, Thomas said, his voice steady as stone. Never was. Never will be. Silence dropped over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Calloway blinked once, twice, as if Thomas had spoken in a foreign language. I'm sorry, the railroad baron said slowly. Did you just refuse me? Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the army of guns. You heard right. A laugh bubbled up from Calloway's throat, not the warm sound of joy, but something cold and sharp. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to, rancher? I own more land than you could walk across in a month. I control railways that span 3 territories. I could buy your entire county and use it for target practice. Maybe so, Thomas replied. But you can't buy what makes a person worth something. Morrison, the lead gunman, shifted nervously in his saddle. Boss, maybe we should just... Quiet. Calloway raised one gloved hand. His pale eyes never left Thomas's face. I'm trying to understand something here. You're willing to die for a girl you barely know. Sarah stepped out from behind Thomas, her chin raised high. He's not dying for a stranger, Papa. He's dying for what's right. The word Papa hit the gathered men like a thunderclap. Several of the hired guns exchanged worried glances. This wasn't just about finding a runaway girl anymore. This was family business, and family business with powerful men often ended badly for everyone involved. Calloway's expression softened for just a moment, so briefly Thomas almost missed it. Sarah, darling, you don't understand the world the way I do. This man, this place, they're nothing. Dust and dreams and empty promises. Come home with me and I'll give you everything money can buy. You already tried that, Sarah said quietly. For 16 years, you gave me everything except what I actually needed. And what was that? Calloway asked, genuine confusion creeping into his voice. Someone who saw me as more than another thing to own. Thomas watched father and daughter face each other across the space of the yard. In the flickering torchlight, he could see the similarities, the same stubborn set to their jaws, the same fire in their eyes. But where Calloway's fire burned cold and calculating, Sarah's blazed with warmth and hope. The railroad baron's face hardened again. You're being foolish, daughter. This man can give you nothing. Look around you, this ranch is dying. The cattle are gone. The land is worthless. In 6 months, the bank will own every stick and stone of this place. You're right, Thomas said, surprising everyone including himself. I got nothing to offer her but hard work and simple food. No fancy dresses or big houses or servants to wait on her hand and foot. Sarah's eyes widened. For a terrible moment, Thomas thought he'd lost her. But, he continued, I can offer her something you never could. And what's that? Calloway sneered. The chance to choose her own life. The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope. In the distance, a coyote howled and the sound seemed to carry all the loneliness of the empty prairie. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud as drum beats. Finally, Calloway spoke. You're making a mistake, rancher. A very expensive mistake. Maybe, Thomas admitted. But it's my mistake to make. The railroad baron turned his attention to the men surrounding them. Mr. Morrison, I believe we've negotiated long enough. Take my daughter. Morrison hesitated. Sir, there's women and children watching from the other homesteads. Word of this will spread. The territorial governor might. The territorial governor does what I tell him to do, Calloway snapped. Now follow your orders. But something had changed in the crowd of hired guns. Thomas could see it in their faces, doubt creeping in like morning fog. These were hard men used to taking what they wanted by force. But there was something about a lone rancher protecting a girl that didn't sit right, even with them. What if she don't want to go? One of the younger gunmen asked suddenly. All eyes turned to him. He was barely out of his teens, with nervous hands and a voice that cracked when he spoke. Calloway's gaze fell on him like a hammer. What did you say? The young man swallowed hard but didn't back down. I said, what if she don't want to go? Seems to me a girl ought to have some say in her own life. You're fired, Calloway said flatly. Actually, the young gunman replied, surprising everyone, I quit. He turned his horse and rode away into the darkness. For a moment, no one moved. Then another man lowered his rifle. This don't feel right, Mr. Calloway, he said, threatening to shoot a man for protecting a girl. My daughter's about her age. Then think about your daughter when I ruin you, Calloway snarled. But the damage was done. Thomas could see uncertainty spreading through the group like wildfire. These men might be hired guns, but they weren't monsters. And there was something about Sarah, her courage, her dignity, that reminded them of their own families. Morrison cleared his throat. Sir, perhaps we should reconsider our approach. The situation has become complicated. Calloway's face turned red as a sunset. The only thing that's complicated is that I'm surrounded by cowards and fools. He spurred his horse forward, riding straight toward Thomas and Sarah. For a heart-stopping moment, Thomas thought the man meant to run them down. But Calloway pulled up short, close enough that Thomas could see the fury blazing in his eyes. You think you've won something here, rancher? He whispered. You think this changes anything? I'll destroy you slowly, piece by piece. I'll take your land, burn your crops, kill your cattle. I'll make you watch everything you care about turn to ash. Thomas looked up at the man who controlled more wealth and power than most kings. You already took everything I cared about when you took her childhood. The rest is just property. For the first time since he'd arrived, Calloway looked uncertain. He stared down at Thomas as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Who are you? He asked quietly. Just a man who knows the difference between having something and deserving it, Thomas replied. Behind them, Sarah stepped forward one more time. Papa, you can take the land. You can take the cattle. You can even take his life. But you can't take what he's given me. And what's that? Hope. The first gunshot cracked like lightning and Thomas's world exploded into chaos. He grabbed Sarah and dove behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead like angry wasps, with splinters showered down on them from the cabin walls. Stay low, Thomas shouted over the thundering noise. Around them, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Morrison's men had opened fire, but not all of them. Thomas could see several riders wheeling their horses away from the fight. Papa, stop this. Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in the gunfire. Thomas risked a quick look over the trough. Calloway sat his horse in the middle of the chaos, untouched by the violence swirling around him. The railroad baron's face showed no emotion. He might have been watching a play instead of a gunfight. A bullet slammed into the water trough, sending up a spray of freezing water. Thomas pulled Sarah closer, his mind racing. They were pinned down with nowhere to run. The barn was 30 yards away across open ground. They'd never make it. Then he heard something that made his heart leap, hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of town. New riders were approaching, and they were coming hard. This is Sheriff Coleman, a voice boomed across the gunfire. Cease firing immediately. The shooting slowed, then stopped altogether. Thomas peeked up to see 6 men in badges surrounding the fight, rifles trained on Morrison's crew. Sheriff Coleman set his horse like a man used to being obeyed. Mr. Calloway, the sheriff called out. I'm going to need you and your men to lower your weapons. Calloway's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Sheriff, you're interfering with private business. Private business doesn't usually involve 20 armed men threatening a citizen on his own property, Coleman replied calmly. Now, I'm asking nicely. Lower your weapons. Morrison looked confused, his rifle half-raised. Boss? What do you want us to do? I want you to remember who pays your wages, Calloway snarled. But the spell was broken. With the law present, Morrison's men no longer looked like an army, they looked like what they really were, hired thugs caught in the act. One by one, they lowered their guns. Thomas helped Sarah to her feet, keeping one eye on Calloway. The railroad baron's face had gone pale with rage, but he was smart enough to know when he'd been outmaneuvered. Sheriff, Thomas called out. Mighty glad to see you. Coleman tipped his hat. Got a report of armed men threatening citizens. Figured I'd better investigate. He turned his attention to Calloway. Sir, I'm going to need an explanation for this gathering. I'm retrieving my daughter, Calloway said stiffly. She's been kidnapped. Kidnapped? Sarah stepped forward, her voice ringing clear in the sudden quiet. I came here on my own, Papa. Mr. Thomas never took me anywhere. Sheriff Coleman studied the girl carefully. Miss, are you here against your will? No, sir. I ran away from school and got caught in a storm. Mr. Thomas gave me shelter when I needed it most. She's lying, Calloway snapped. She's just a child. She doesn't know what's best for her. She's old enough to speak for herself, Coleman replied. And from what I can see, she seems to be doing just fine. The sheriff dismounted and walked over to examine the bullet holes in Thomas's cabin. Somebody want to explain why there's been shooting here? Morrison spoke up before Calloway could answer. Mr. Calloway ordered us to take the girl. When the rancher refused, things got heated. Heated enough to open fire on an unarmed man? Coleman's voice was dangerously quiet. It was self-defense, one of the gunmen protested weakly. The sheriff looked around at the scene, the bullet-riddled cabin, the overturned furniture visible through the windows, Thomas and Sarah huddled together with no weapons in sight. Self-defense, he repeated slowly. Against what? A man protecting a girl who came to him for help. Calloway finally dismounted, his expensive boots clicking on the frozen ground. Sheriff, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can work something out between reasonable men. Coleman smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Oh, I'm sure we can, Mr. Calloway. Starting with you and your men coming with me to town to answer some questions. You can't arrest me, Calloway protested. I haven't broken any laws. Threatening an unarmed citizen with deadly force is assault, Coleman replied. Firing weapons on someone's property without cause is attempted murder. And intimidating witnesses is a felony. He gestured to his deputies. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Calloway and his associates to town. Thomas watched in amazement as the most powerful man in the territory was surrounded by lawmen. Calloway's face had gone from pale to purple and his hands shook with barely controlled fury. This isn't over, rancher, he hissed as the deputies moved closer. You have no idea what you've started. Actually, Sarah said quietly, I think I do. She walked over to her father, moving with a grace that seemed older than her 16 years. When she spoke, her voice carried across the yard like a bell. Papa, for my whole life, you've told me that power means getting what you want. That money can buy anything, including people. She gestured toward Thomas, who stood watching with mud on his clothes and dignity in his bearing. But this man has something you've never understood. And what's that? Calloway asked mockingly. He knows the difference between taking something and earning it. The railroad baron stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. You're choosing him over your own father? I'm choosing freedom over fear, Sarah replied. I'm choosing kindness over cruelty. I'm choosing a man who sees me as a person instead of property. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. Miss, you're welcome to come to town with us if you'd prefer. The judge can help sort out your legal situation. Sarah looked back at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Thank you, Sheriff. I think that would be wise. As the strange procession prepared to leave, deputies surrounding Calloway's men, Sarah riding beside the sheriff, Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Morrison standing there, his gun holstered. Rancher, the gunman said quietly, I want you to know, not all of us wanted this fight. Thomas studied the man's weathered face. Then why'd you come? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Money, he admitted. Good money to find a runaway girl and bring her home. Seemed simple enough. He gestured toward Sarah, who was speaking earnestly with Sheriff Coleman. But that ain't just any runaway girl, is it? No, Thomas agreed. She ain't. Takes guts to stand up to a man like Calloway, Morrison continued. More guts than I got, anyway. The gunman mounted his horse and prepared to follow the others to town. But he paused at the edge of the yard. Rancher? Watch your back. Calloway don't forget and he don't forgive. This fight's over, but the war's just starting. Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone in his bullet-scarred yard. The silence felt strange after all the shouting and gunfire. In the distance, he could hear the hoofbeats fading toward town. Thomas walked slowly back to his cabin, stepping over broken glass and splintered wood. The place looked like a battlefield, but somehow it felt more like home than it had in months. Because for the first time since Martha died, Thomas Whitmore had remembered what it felt like to fight for something worth saving. The gunfire stopped so fast it made everyone's ears ring. Sarah walked straight toward her father like she owned the whole world. Her dress was still muddy and torn, but something had changed in her face. She looked older. Stronger. Like she had found a secret weapon nobody knew about. Papa, she called out, her voice cutting through the night air like a sharp knife. You want me back so badly? Then let's talk business. Calloway stepped down from his horse. His expensive boots made clicking sounds on the frozen ground. The hired guns around him shifted nervously. They had signed up to catch a runaway girl, not watch a family fight that might end their careers. You're in no place to make demands, Sarah, he said. But Thomas could hear something new in the man's voice. Fear. Sarah smiled the same cold smile her father was famous for. Oh, but I am, Papa. You see, I've been reading your letters. All of them. The silence that followed was thicker than winter fog. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Thomas watched from behind his overturned table, amazed at how this small girl had just made the most powerful man in the territory go pale as fresh snow. What letters? Calloway asked, but his voice cracked just a little. Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out a small bundle tied with ribbon. The ones you hid in your desk. The ones about the Colorado Railroad deal. The ones where you talk about burning out farmers who won't sell. The ones where you mention bribing Judge Henderson and Sheriff Morrison. Morrison, the leader of the hired guns, took a step back. His face had gone white too. Now wait just a minute. Oh, you're in these letters too, Mr. Morrison, Sarah continued sweetly. Papa writes about how much he pays you to look the other way when his men do their dirty work. Thomas felt his heart pounding. This wasn't just about getting Sarah back anymore. This was about secrets that could destroy powerful men. Secrets that could get them all killed. But Sarah wasn't done. She walked closer to her father, the letters held high where everyone could see them. I also have the bank records, Papa. The ones that show how you've been stealing money from the railroad company. The ones that prove you're not as rich as everyone thinks. Calloway's face turned red with anger. You little fool. Do you have any idea what you're doing? I'm saving my friend, Sarah said simply. And I'm stopping you from hurting any more good people. The hired guns started looking at each other with worried expressions. If these letters got out, they would all be in trouble. Big trouble. The kind that meant jail time or worse. Thomas decided it was time to move. He stood up from behind his table, rifle in hand. Seems like your daughter has grown up, Calloway. Maybe it's time you listen to her. This is family business, rancher, Calloway snarled. Stay out of it. He can't stay out of it, Sarah said firmly. Because I'm making him part of my family. I'm staying here, Papa. With Thomas. And if you try to stop me, these letters go straight to the territorial governor. The night air crackled with tension. Thomas could see Calloway's mind working, trying to find a way out of the trap his own daughter had set for him. You don't understand the world, Sarah, Calloway said, his voice getting desperate. These men, this land, none of it will last. Only money lasts. Only power protects you. You're wrong, Papa, Sarah replied. Her voice was steady and sure. Thomas protected me without any money at all. He protected me because it was the right thing to do. That's stronger than all your money. Morrison stepped forward, his hand on his gun. Boss, maybe we should just take her and sort this out later. Touch her and die, Thomas said quietly. His rifle was pointed straight at Morrison's chest. But Sarah held up her hand. No more violence. There's been enough. She looked at her father with sad eyes. Papa, I'm giving you a choice. Walk away now, leave Thomas alone, and these letters stay with me. Try to force me to come with you and I'll make sure every newspaper in the territory gets copies. You're bluffing, Calloway said, but he didn't sound sure. Sarah reached into her dress again and pulled out more papers. These are copies, Papa. I already sent the originals to 3 different newspapers in Denver. If I don't send them a telegram by tomorrow saying I'm safe, they'll print everything. Thomas whistled low under his breath. This girl had planned everything. She wasn't just brave, she was smart. Smarter than her father had ever given her credit for. Calloway looked around at his hired guns. He could see the doubt in their eyes. They were wondering if their jobs were worth going to prison for. How do I know you won't use those letters anyway? He asked. Because unlike you, I keep my promises, Sarah said. Leave us alone and your secrets stay secret. But if you ever hurt Thomas or try to take his land, everyone will know what kind of man you really are. The railroad baron stood there for a long moment, weighing his choices. His empire against his freedom. His power against his daughter's love. Finally, he nodded slowly. Very well. But don't come crying to me when this life gets hard, Sarah. Don't expect any help from me. I don't want your help, Papa, Sarah said softly. I just want you to let me be happy. Calloway turned toward his horse, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mount up, he told his men. We're leaving. As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Thomas felt like he could breathe again. But he also knew this wasn't really over. Men like Calloway didn't give up that easily. You think he'll keep his word? Thomas asked. Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes. For now. But we'll need to be ready. Papa doesn't like to lose. Morning came like a gift wrapped in golden sunlight. Thomas woke up on his kitchen floor where he had slept to guard the door. His back ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in months. Through the window, he could see Sarah already outside, feeding his few remaining chickens with yesterday's breadcrumbs. She had stayed. Despite everything, the danger, the threats, the choice between comfort and uncertainty, she had chosen to stay with him. Thomas walked outside, stretching his sore muscles. The November air was crisp and clean, like the world had been washed fresh during the night. Sleep well? Sarah asked, scattering the last of the crumbs. Like a baby, Thomas lied. Truth was, he had barely slept at all. Every sound had made him reach for his rifle. But seeing Sarah safe and smiling made the sleepless night worth it. I've been thinking, Sarah said, wiping her hands on her apron. About what happens next. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Having second thoughts? No, she said quickly. But I think we need a plan. Papa might have left, but his problems haven't. If those letters get out, a lot of powerful people will be angry. We need to be ready. Thomas nodded. The girl was right. They had won the battle, but the war might just be starting. What do you suggest? He asked. First, we need allies. People who will stand with us if Papa changes his mind. Second, we need to make this ranch profitable again. And third, she paused, looking a little embarrassed, we need to make me legal. I can't just be a runaway forever. Thomas scratched his beard. How do we do that? Well, Sarah said slowly, you could adopt me. Legally, I mean. Then Papa couldn't force me to come back, even if he wanted to. The idea hit Thomas like a warm wave. A daughter. After all these years of loneliness, he could have a daughter again. Would you want that? He asked carefully. To be a rancher's daughter instead of a railroad princess? Sarah laughed, the sound bright as morning bells. Thomas, I've never been happier than I have been these past few days. Even with all the danger and worry. That's worth more than all Papa's money. They spent the morning making plans. Sarah knew about business from watching her father's meetings. She had ideas about raising sheep instead of cattle, about growing vegetables to sell in town, about turning part of the ranch into a school for children whose parents worked the mines. You really think we can make this work? Thomas asked as they sat down to a lunch of beans and cornbread. I know we can, Sarah said confidently. We just have to be smart about it. And we have something Papa never understood. What's that? We actually care about people. That makes all the difference. That afternoon, visitors started arriving. First came Doc Peterson from town, riding his old mule and carrying his black bag. Heard there was some excitement out here last night, he said, climbing down stiffly. Thought I'd check if anyone needed patching up. We're fine, Doc, Thomas said. But thank you for coming. Good, Doc said. Then he lowered his voice. Also wanted you to know there's talk in town. About what you did? Standing up to Calloway like that. Folks are impressed. Next came the Miller family from the next ranch over. They brought fresh bread and news that the bank president wanted to meet with Thomas about his loan. Seems someone told him that foreclosing on you might not be good for business, Mrs. Miller said with a wink. By evening, a dozen people had stopped by. Ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers from town. All of them had heard about the standoff. All of them wanted to thank Thomas for proving that ordinary people could stand up to bullies. You started something, Sarah told him as they watched the last visitors ride away. People have been afraid of Papa for so long they forgot they had power too. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since Martha died. Hope. Real hope for the future. Sarah, he said quietly, I want you to know something. Taking you in wasn't charity. You've given me more than I've given you. How so? She asked, looking up from the book she was reading. You reminded me who I used to be. Before the grief and the worry took over. You reminded me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to fight for. Sarah smiled and scooted closer to him on the old sofa. Well, you reminded me that real strength isn't about having power over people. It's about having the courage to protect them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance and listening to the wind outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be paperwork to file, plans to make, and probably more trouble from people who didn't like change. But tonight, they had each other. They had a warm fire and a solid roof over their heads. They had the satisfaction of knowing they had stood up for what was right. Most importantly, they had learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love and protect each other no matter what the world throws at you. Thomas? Sarah said sleepily. Yeah? Thank you for letting me stay. Thomas reached over and patted her shoulder gently. Thank you for choosing to. Outside, the November wind still blew across the Wyoming plains. But inside their small cabin, two people who had found each other in the storm were building something new. Something that would last longer than railroad empires or political power. They were building a home.